History remembers him as one of the most infamous figures ever to live. Adolf Hitler was not born into power, he was not born into royalty. Yet he would rise from obscurity to lead one of the most destructive regimes in human history. Born in Austria in 1889, Hitler spent his early life struggling with failure, poverty, and rejection. But within those struggles, he developed beliefs that would later shape an ideology built on extreme nationalism, racial hatred, and authoritarian control. Through political manipulation, propaganda, and calculated ambition, he transformed Germany during a time of national humiliation and economic collapse. Millions followed him, believing he could restore their nation's pride. Instead, his rule would ignite World War II, a conflict that would devastate continents, claim tens of millions of lives, and lead to unimaginable human suffering, including the Holocaust. Hitler's story is not only the story of one man. It is a warning about power, manipulation, and the fragile nature of societies during times of crisis. The birth of an ideology. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in the small town of Braunau am Inn, located near the border between Austria and Germany. It was a quiet place, far removed from the political storms that would later define his life. His father, Alois Hitler, was a strict customs official, disciplined, authoritarian, and demanding. His mother, Clara, was gentle and deeply protective of her son. Between these two opposing influences, young Adolf grew up in a household marked by tension and emotional contrast. From an early age, Hitler showed little interest in following his father's career path in government service. Instead, he became fascinated with art, architecture, and German cultural history. He dreamed of becoming an artist, imagining a future shaped by creativity rather than authority. But his dreams would collapse before they could fully form. As a teenager, Hitler moved to Vienna with hopes of attending the prestigious Academy of Fine Arts. He believed his talent would secure admission and open the door to a successful artistic career. He was rejected. Not once, but twice. The Academy judged his work as lacking the creative skill required for painting, though they noted his talent in architectural sketches. The rejection devastated him. Without formal education, stable income, or clear direction, Hitler drifted into poverty. Vienna at the time was a city of striking contrasts. Grand imperial buildings stood beside overcrowded neighborhoods filled with struggling workers and political tension. The city was also a melting pot of ethnic groups, religions, and competing national identities. During these years, Hitler began developing political beliefs that would later define his ideology. He absorbed nationalist ideas circulating through parts of Austrian and German society, along with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that blamed Jewish communities and political elites for economic and social struggles. Historians debate how deeply these beliefs formed during his Vienna years, but it is clear that the environment shaped his worldview. Poverty, isolation, and resentment gradually hardened into anger and radical nationalism. By 1913, Hitler left Vienna and moved to Munich, Germany. He was drawn to what he saw as the cultural and political heart of the German-speaking world. He admired Germany's military tradition and believed strongly in the concept of a unified German nation. Only a year later, Europe would erupt into chaos. In 1914, World War I began. For Hitler, the war felt like destiny. When Germany entered the war, Hitler volunteered for military service in the Bavarian army. Unlike many soldiers who feared the battlefield, Hitler embraced the conflict with intense enthusiasm. He served primarily as a dispatch runner, a dangerous role requiring him to carry messages between frontline positions during combat. The job exposed him to constant risk. Explosions, artillery fire, and sniper attacks surrounded him daily. Several times, he narrowly escaped death. He was wounded during the war and later temporarily blinded by a gas attack in 1918. Despite the horrors of trench warfare, Hitler found purpose within military life. The army gave him structure, belonging, and identity, things he had struggled to find during his earlier years. He developed strong loyalty toward Germany and believed deeply in the cause he was fighting for. For his service, he received military decorations, including the Iron Cross. But by late 1918, Germany's situation was collapsing. Germany faced defeat. Economic exhaustion, military losses, and internal political unrest forced the government to seek peace. The war ended with Germany's surrender, followed by the Treaty of Versailles, an agreement that imposed severe territorial losses, military restrictions, and enormous financial reparations on the defeated nation. For many Germans, the treaty felt like humiliation. For Hitler, it became a personal obsession. While recovering from his gas injuries in a hospital, he learned of Germany's surrender. According to later accounts, he experienced the moment as a devastating betrayal. He began embracing a conspiracy theory known as the stab in the back myth, the false belief that Germany had not been defeated militarily, but betrayed internally by politicians, socialists, and Jewish communities. This belief would become central to his future political message. After the war, Germany entered a period of extreme instability. The old imperial government collapsed, replaced by the fragile Weimar Republic. Economic crisis, inflation, unemployment, and political violence spread across the country. Armed groups fought in the streets. Revolutionary movements threatened government control. Amid this chaos, Hitler struggled to find direction once again. But this time, he would not turn to art. He turned to politics. In 1919, while still working as a soldier assigned to monitor political activity, Hitler attended a meeting of a small nationalist group called the German Workers' Party. The party was minor and largely unknown, but its message of nationalism and anti-Versailles resentment immediately attracted him. During one meeting, Hitler unexpectedly spoke out during a political debate. His passionate and aggressive speaking style impressed party leaders. They quickly recognized his talent for persuasion and invited him to join. Hitler accepted. What began as a small political involvement soon became an obsession. He discovered that his ability to speak emotionally and dramatically could influence large audiences. Crowds responded to his anger, his promises of national revival, and his simple explanations for complex social problems. He had found his new purpose. Not as an artist, not as a soldier, but as a political agitator determined to reshape Germany's future. Within a few years, Hitler would transform the small German Workers' Party into a movement that would grow rapidly across the country. He would refine his ideology, build loyal supporters, and begin constructing the political path that would eventually lead him to national power. But at this stage, he remained only a rising voice in a wounded nation searching desperately for answers. Germany was unstable, its people were angry, and Hitler was preparing to turn that anger into a political weapon. The stage was being set for his rise. The rise of the Nazi movement. By the early 1920s, Germany was a nation drowning in instability. The Weimar Republic, formed after World War I, struggled to hold control over a country broken by economic collapse, political violence, and national humiliation. Inflation soared so rapidly that money lost value within hours. Workers carried stacks of banknotes just to buy bread. Veterans returned home to unemployment and bitterness. Many Germans believed their country had been robbed of dignity. In this climate of anger and desperation, Adolf Hitler found fertile ground for his ideas. And he began turning frustration into a movement. After joining the German Workers' Party, Hitler quickly rose through its ranks. He possessed a rare talent, the ability to electrify crowds with emotional, aggressive speeches. His words blended nationalism, blame, and promises of renewal. He spoke about restoring German pride, rejecting the Treaty of Versailles, and uniting all German-speaking people under one powerful state. His speeches were not calm political discussions. They were theatrical performances. Hitler studied crowd psychology carefully. He often began speaking slowly, building tension before unleashing explosive emotional appeals. He used simple language, repeating key ideas until they became unforgettable. He positioned himself as both victim and savior, a man who claimed to share the people's suffering while promising to lead them out of it. Audiences responded. Membership in the party began to grow. In 1920, the group renamed itself the National Socialist German Workers' Party, later known simply as the Nazi Party. The new name was designed to attract both working-class voters and nationalist conservatives. Despite the word socialist in its title, the party's ideology focused heavily on extreme nationalism, authoritarian leadership, and racial theories. The Nazis promoted the belief that Germans belonged to a superior racial community and blamed minorities, especially Jewish communities, for Germany's economic and political problems. The party also developed symbols and propaganda designed to unify supporters. The swastika became its official emblem, presented as a sign of strength and rebirth. Uniforms, rallies, and slogans created a sense of identity and belonging among followers. Hitler understood that movements were not built on policies alone. They were built on emotion, spectacle, and loyalty. As the Nazi Party expanded, Hitler established a paramilitary group known as the Sturmabteilung, or SA, often called the Brown Shirts. Their role was to protect Nazi meetings, intimidate political opponents, and demonstrate the party's growing power on the streets. Political violence became increasingly common in Germany. Rival parties clashed with fists, weapons, and organized street battles. The Weimar government struggled to maintain order. Hitler began believing that Germany's democratic system was weak and destined to fail. He concluded that real change could only come through force. And in 1923, he decided to act. Inspired partly by political upheavals in Italy, where Benito Mussolini had seized power through mass mobilization, Hitler attempted to overthrow the German government in what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch. On the night of November 8, 1923, Hitler and his supporters stormed a political gathering in Munich, hoping to spark a nationwide revolution. Armed Nazis forced their way into a crowded beer hall where regional leaders were meeting. Hitler declared that the national government had been overthrown and demanded support for his uprising. At first, confusion and fear allowed the rebels to take control of the hall. Hitler believed the German military and public would rally behind him. They did not. The following day, Hitler and approximately 2,000 supporters marched through Munich streets, attempting to seize government buildings. But police forces confronted them before they could succeed. Gunfire erupted. The confrontation lasted only minutes, but the result was devastating for the Nazi movement. 16 Nazi supporters and several police officers were killed. Hitler fled but was arrested shortly afterward. The attempted coup had failed completely. Many believed Hitler's political career was finished. Instead, the trial would give him his first national spotlight. During his trial for treason, Hitler transformed the courtroom into a stage. He used the proceedings to present himself as a patriotic German fighting against a corrupt government. His speeches attracted enormous media attention. Newspapers across Germany reported his arguments, spreading his message far beyond Munich. Rather than appearing as a criminal, Hitler portrayed himself as a defender of national honor. His dramatic testimony gained sympathy from nationalist audiences and introduced his ideas to millions of Germans for the first time. The court found him guilty. But the punishment was surprisingly light. Hitler was sentenced to 5 years in prison, yet he would serve less than one. Hitler was imprisoned in Landsberg prison, where he experienced conditions far more comfortable than most inmates. He received visitors regularly, wrote extensively, and used the time to reflect on his failed coup. It was during this imprisonment that he began writing his political manifesto, Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. The book outlined his worldview, combining extreme nationalism, racial ideology, anti-Semitism, and expansionist ambitions. Hitler argued that Germany needed strong authoritarian leadership and territorial expansion to secure its future. He also described his belief that propaganda, mass mobilization, and absolute loyalty were essential for building political power. Though initially not widely popular, Mein Kampf would later become one of the most influential and dangerous political texts of the 20th century. Perhaps the most important lesson Hitler learned in prison was strategic. He realized that seizing power through violent rebellion had failed. Instead, he concluded that he could exploit Germany's democratic system to gain legal control and then dismantle democracy from within. When Hitler was released from prison in 1924, he returned to a Nazi party weakened by internal divisions and declining membership. But he now possessed clearer vision, stronger determination, and growing national recognition. He reorganized the party structure, strengthened propaganda networks, and focused on expanding support across Germany. At the time, few people imagined how far this movement would go. Germany was beginning to recover economically during the mid-1920s, and extremist groups lost some influence. The Nazi Party remained relatively small compared to major political organizations. But Hitler was patient. He believed Germany's stability was temporary, and he was waiting for the next crisis. That crisis would arrive at the end of the decade, when global economic collapse would shake Germany once again, creating the conditions Hitler had been preparing for. The stage was set for his transformation from fringe political leader to a figure who would soon dominate an entire nation. The seizure of power. By the late 1920s, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party remained on the edges of German politics. They had followers, rallies, and growing attention, but they were far from controlling the nation. Germany, though still fragile, was slowly stabilizing. Employment improved. Cultural life flourished. Many citizens believed the worst years after World War I were finally behind them. Then, in 1929, the world economy collapsed. And with it, Germany's fragile recovery shattered. The Great Depression spread across continents with devastating speed. Banks failed. Factories closed. Trade collapsed. In Germany, millions lost their jobs within months. Families struggled to buy food. Poverty and despair returned with terrifying intensity. The democratic government appeared powerless to stop the crisis. Political parties argued endlessly while conditions worsened. Street violence between extremist groups became common again. Many Germans began searching desperately for strong leadership, someone who promised certainty in a world that seemed to be falling apart. Hitler saw opportunity, and he moved quickly. The Nazi Party launched an aggressive propaganda campaign across Germany. Posters, radio speeches, parades, and massive rallies flooded cities and towns. Hitler presented himself as a man of destiny, someone who understood the people's suffering and possessed the strength to restore national pride. His speeches blamed Germany's economic collapse on multiple enemies: the Treaty of Versailles, political elites, communists, and Jewish communities. His message simplified complex economic problems into emotional narratives that many desperate citizens found easy to believe. The Nazi Party promised 3 powerful ideas: national unity, economic revival, strong leadership. For millions of struggling Germans, these promises felt like hope. The party's popularity exploded. In parliamentary elections during the early 1930s, Nazi candidates gained millions of votes. By 1932, the Nazi Party had become the largest political party in Germany's parliament, though they still lacked an absolute majority. Germany's government entered a dangerous deadlock. Presidents and politicians struggled to form stable coalitions. Fear of communist revolution frightened conservative elites and wealthy industrial leaders. Many of them began believing Hitler could be controlled if given power. They were dangerously mistaken. On January 30th, 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. To many observers, the appointment appeared temporary, a political compromise meant to stabilize government while keeping Hitler under control. Traditional conservative politicians believed they could manipulate him from behind the scenes. Instead, they had just handed him the gateway to absolute power. Hitler moved immediately. Only weeks after becoming chancellor, disaster struck Germany's parliament building, the Reichstag, when it was destroyed by fire on February 27, 1933. The fire created shock and panic across the country. Hitler and Nazi leaders quickly blamed communist revolutionaries, claiming the fire was part of a larger plot to overthrow the government. Historians still debate who was truly responsible, but the Nazis used the crisis to their full advantage. Hitler convinced President Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree. The decree suspended basic civil liberties across Germany. Freedom of speech, privacy, and political assembly were suddenly eliminated. Police gained authority to arrest political opponents without trial. Thousands of communists, socialists, and critics were imprisoned within weeks. Democracy was being dismantled legally. In March 1933, Hitler introduced the Enabling Act, one of the most critical laws in modern history. The law allowed Hitler and his cabinet to pass legislation without parliamentary approval. It effectively gave him dictatorial power while maintaining the illusion of constitutional government. Nazi intimidation and political pressure ensured the law passed. Germany's democratic system was now finished. Hitler had seized total control. Over the next year, Hitler eliminated all political opposition. Rival parties were banned. Labor unions were dissolved. Independent newspapers were silenced or forced into Nazi control. Political opponents were arrested or driven into exile. To enforce loyalty, the Nazis expanded a vast security network. The Gestapo, the secret police, monitored citizens, suppressed resistance, and created an atmosphere of constant fear. Concentration camps began appearing, originally built to imprison political prisoners. Meanwhile, Nazi propaganda reached every corner of German society. Schools, films, newspapers, and public events promoted loyalty to Hitler and Nazi ideology. Children were encouraged to join youth organizations where they were trained in nationalist beliefs and obedience to authority. Hitler's image transformed into something almost mythical. He became known as the Führer, the supreme leader. In 1934, a major turning point solidified Hitler's control over Germany's military and government. The Nazi Party's own paramilitary organization, the SA, had grown powerful and unstable under its leader, Ernst Röhm. Röhm demanded greater influence over the German army, alarming both military commanders and conservative allies. Hitler responded with ruthless efficiency. During an event later known as the Night of the Long Knives, Nazi forces executed Röhm and dozens of other political enemies, including former allies. The purge shocked Germany, but also reassured the military that Hitler would protect its authority. Soon afterward, President Hindenburg died. Hitler merged the roles of chancellor and president, declaring himself Führer of Germany. Soldiers and government officials were now required to swear personal loyalty to him, not to the Constitution, not to the nation, but to Hitler himself. Germany had become a dictatorship. Under Nazi rule, The government began implementing racial laws targeting Jewish citizens and other minority groups. Jewish businesses were boycotted. Professionals were removed from public service. Civil rights were stripped away gradually but systematically. Many Germans supported or ignored these changes, influenced by propaganda or fear of punishment. Others quietly resisted, but resistance became increasingly dangerous. Meanwhile, Hitler focused on rebuilding Germany's military strength, openly violating the Treaty of Versailles. Massive public works projects reduced unemployment and created the appearance of national revival. Roads, factories, and weapons industries expanded rapidly. Germany looked strong again. But the rebuilding was preparing the nation for war. By the late 1930s, Hitler had transformed Germany completely. He controlled the government, that he controlled the military, that he controlled public opinion through propaganda and fear. And now, he began turning his attention beyond Germany's borders. Hitler believed Germany needed expansion to survive. He called this idea Lebensraum, living space, arguing that Germany must conquer territory in Eastern Europe to secure resources and power. Diplomacy would soon give way to aggression. The world was moving toward another global conflict, and Hitler was preparing to ignite it. The war that consumed the world. By the late 1930s, Adolf Hitler had transformed Germany into one of the most powerful military states in Europe. Factories produced weapons at unprecedented speed. New tanks, aircraft, and warships rolled out of assembly lines. Millions of soldiers trained under strict discipline and nationalist fervor. To many Germans, it felt like their nation had risen from humiliation to strength in less than a decade. But Hitler's ambitions stretched far beyond rebuilding Germany. He wanted expansion. He wanted dominance. And he was prepared to risk the entire world to achieve it. Hitler began testing Europe's willingness to resist his growing power. In 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland, a region that had been declared demilitarized after World War I. The move directly violated international agreements, but no major power responded with military action. The success emboldened Hitler. He concluded that European nations feared war too much to stop him. 2 years later, he moved again. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria in an event known as the Anschluss. Many Austrians welcomed the Union, and foreign governments once again avoided confrontation. Shortly afterward, Hitler demanded control over parts of Czechoslovakia, claiming to protect ethnic Germans living there. European leaders met with him in what became known as the Munich Agreement. Hoping to avoid another devastating war, they allowed Hitler to seize territory in exchange for promises of peace. The promises were meaningless. Within months, Germany occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, proving that Hitler's ambitions had no limits. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The attack marked the beginning of World War II. German forces used a revolutionary military strategy called Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Instead of slow trench battles like World War I, Blitzkrieg relied on speed, coordination, and overwhelming force. Tanks, aircraft, and mechanized infantry moved rapidly, breaking enemy defenses before they could organize resistance. Poland collapsed within weeks. 2 days after the invasion, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The world had entered its most destructive conflict in human history. And for a time, Hitler appeared unstoppable. Between 1939 and 1941, Nazi Germany achieved a series of shocking military victories. Denmark and Norway fell quickly. Then Germany launched a massive offensive across Western Europe. Belgium and the Netherlands collapsed under the Blitzkrieg assault. France, one of Europe's strongest military powers, surrendered in just 6 weeks. The speed of these victories stunned the world. German forces marched triumphantly through Paris. Hitler stood before the Eiffel Tower, symbolizing the peak of his power. Much of Europe now lay under Nazi control or influence. Only Britain remained defiant. Hitler attempted to force Britain into submission through relentless air attacks, known as the Battle of Britain. German bombers targeted cities, factories, and military bases, hoping to destroy British resistance and prepare for invasion. But Britain refused to surrender. The Royal Air Force defended the skies fiercely, preventing Germany from gaining air superiority. After months of intense bombing and civilian casualties, Hitler postponed plans for invasion. Britain survived, becoming a crucial base for future Allied resistance. Yet Hitler was already planning his most ambitious campaign and his most dangerous mistake. In June 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was one of the largest military operations ever attempted. Millions of German soldiers advanced deep into Soviet territory, capturing vast regions and destroying entire armies. At first, the invasion appeared successful. German forces pushed toward major cities, including Moscow and Leningrad. But the Soviet Union was enormous. Its population, industrial capacity, and brutal winter conditions slowed the German advance. Supply lines stretched thin. Soldiers faced freezing temperatures, starvation, and fierce Soviet resistance. The war in the East turned into a brutal struggle of survival that would drain Germany's resources and manpower. While the war expanded, another horrific chapter unfolded behind the front lines. Nazi racial ideology moved from discrimination to systematic mass murder. The regime had long persecuted Jewish communities, stripping them of rights, property, and citizenship. But during the war, Nazi leaders implemented what they called the final solution, a coordinated plan to eliminate Jewish populations across Europe. Millions of Jewish men, women, and children were deported to ghettos, forced labor camps, and extermination camps. Other groups, including Roma communities, disabled individuals, political prisoners, and many others, also became victims of Nazi persecution. The Holocaust became one of the darkest crimes in human history, resulting in the deaths of 6 million Jewish people and millions of other victims. It was a tragedy that forever changed global understanding of human cruelty and responsibility. By 1942, Nazi Germany reached the height of its territorial power. From the Atlantic Ocean to deep inside Soviet lands, Hitler's empire controlled or influenced much of Europe. Axis allies, including Italy and Japan, fought alongside Germany, expanding the global scale of the conflict. Yet beneath this appearance of dominance, cracks were forming. Germany was fighting a war on multiple fronts. Resources were stretched, casualties increased rapidly, and powerful enemies were gathering strength. In the East, Soviet forces regrouped and prepared massive counterattacks. In the West, Britain continued resisting while the United States, after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, entered the war, bringing enormous industrial and military strength to the Allied side. Hitler had provoked a global coalition far stronger than he had anticipated. The turning point came during the Battle of Stalingrad between 1942 and 1943. German forces attempted to capture the Soviet city bearing the name of their enemy's leader. The battle turned into a brutal urban nightmare. Soldiers fought street by street, building by building, through freezing winter conditions and constant bombardment. Eventually, Soviet forces surrounded the German army. Cut off from supplies and reinforcements, nearly an entire German army was destroyed. The defeat shocked Germany and marked the beginning of a long retreat across Eastern Europe. The myth of Nazi invincibility was shattered. After Stalingrad, Germany's military situation deteriorated rapidly. Allied forces began reclaiming territory across Europe and North Africa. Bombing campaigns devastated German cities and industrial centers. Resources became scarce. Morale declined. Hitler, however, refused to accept defeat. He demanded absolute loyalty and continued launching desperate military operations, even as evidence of collapse became impossible to ignore. His leadership grew increasingly isolated, shaped by paranoia and unrealistic strategies. The war he had ignited was now turning against him, and Germany was heading toward destruction. The collapse of the Third Reich. By 1944, Adolf Hitler's empire was no longer expanding. It was collapsing. Across Europe, Allied forces pushed back against German armies on every front. Cities once celebrated as symbols of Nazi power were reduced to ruins. Supply lines crumbled. Soldiers retreated under relentless pressure. What had once been presented as an unstoppable Reich was now fighting simply to survive. But Hitler refused to accept reality, and his refusal would drag Germany deeper into destruction. In June 1944, Allied forces launched one of the most decisive operations of World War II, the D-Day invasion of Normandy. Thousands of ships crossed the English Channel. Tens of thousands of Allied soldiers stormed heavily defended beaches in northern France. The invasion marked the beginning of Western Europe's liberation from Nazi control. German defenses fought fiercely, but they could not stop the massive Allied advance. Within weeks, Allied armies pushed inland, capturing cities and forcing German troops into retreat. France, which had fallen so quickly years earlier, was gradually freed from occupation. At the same time, Soviet forces advanced from the east with overwhelming strength. After their victory at Stalingrad, Soviet armies launched massive counteroffensives, reclaiming territory across Eastern Europe and pushing steadily toward Germany's borders. Germany was now trapped between two enormous military powers, and both were closing in. Inside Germany, life became increasingly desperate. Allied bombing campaigns devastated major cities, including Berlin, Hamburg, and Dresden. Industrial centers burned. Transportation networks collapsed. Millions of civilians lost homes and family members. Food shortages and constant air raids shattered daily life. Despite the destruction, Nazi propaganda continued insisting that victory was still possible. Hitler demanded total loyalty and ordered civilians, including teenagers and elderly men, to join desperate defensive militias. Many Germans obeyed out of fear or loyalty. Others simply hoped to survive. By early 1945, Soviet forces reached the outskirts of Berlin, the capital of the Third Reich, once filled with grand Nazi architecture, rallies, and military parades, now stood as a battlefield. Explosions shook the city day and night. Buildings collapsed into rubble. Civilians fled or hid underground as artillery fire rained down across streets and neighborhoods. Deep beneath the city, Adolf Hitler withdrew into his Führer bunker, an underground command center located beneath the Reich Chancellery. Here, surrounded by a shrinking circle of loyal officials, Hitler prepared for the final stage of his rule. Inside the bunker, conditions grew increasingly tense and surreal. Hitler's health had deteriorated. Years of stress, illness, and heavy medication left him physically weakened and mentally unstable. Yet he continued issuing military orders based on imaginary divisions and non-existent reinforcements. His generals struggled to explain that Germany's armies were collapsing across every front. Hitler refused to listen. He blamed generals, soldiers, and even the German people for failing him. His speeches grew filled with anger, denial, and despair. He insisted that if Germany could not win, it deserved to be destroyed. Meanwhile, Soviet troops advanced closer each day. The sound of artillery echoed constantly through the bunker walls. The end was approaching. On April 29, 1945, as Berlin burned above him, Hitler made one final personal decision. He married Eva Braun, his longtime companion, in a brief ceremony inside the bunker. The marriage was quiet, almost symbolic, an attempt to create a moment of normal life amid total collapse. Within hours of the ceremony, Hitler prepared for his death. He understood that Soviet forces would soon capture Berlin. He feared being taken prisoner and displayed as a symbol of defeat. Like many dictators before him, he chose to control his own ending. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler died by suicide inside the bunker alongside Eva Braun. His body was later burned according to his instructions. The man who had dominated Germany and terrorized much of the world ended his life hidden underground, while his empire collapsed above him. Only days later, Berlin surrendered to Soviet forces. On May 8, 1945, Germany officially surrendered to Allied forces, marking the end of World War II in Europe. The Third Reich, which Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years, had survived only 12. The cost of Hitler's rule was catastrophic. World War II caused the deaths of more than 70 million people across continents. Entire cities were destroyed. Nations were left in ruins. Families were shattered by loss and displacement. The Holocaust left a permanent scar on human history, revealing the terrifying consequences of hatred, propaganda, and unchecked power. The war also reshaped global politics. Germany was divided. Europe entered a long period of recovery and Cold War tension. International organizations formed to prevent future global conflicts. The world would never be the same. Historians continue to study Hitler not to glorify him, but to understand how such a figure gained power. His rise demonstrated how economic crisis, political instability, and manipulation of fear can weaken democratic societies. His rule showed how propaganda and authoritarian control can turn ordinary citizens into supporters or silent witnesses of extreme cruelty. Hitler's story remains one of the strongest warnings in modern history. A reminder that destructive ideologies can grow when societies abandon critical thinking, tolerance, and democratic institutions. The man who promised Germany glory left behind devastation. The empire he built through violence collapsed into ashes. But the lessons of that era continue to echo across generations, urging humanity to remember, to question, and to prevent such tragedies from ever happening again. The shadow that history cannot forget. And so, the story of Adolf Hitler comes to its end. Not with triumph, not with glory, but with silence beneath a ruined city. He rose from obscurity, driven by anger, ambition, and a vision that promised revival to a broken nation. Millions believed in him. Millions followed him. And for a moment in history, it seemed as though he had reshaped the world itself. But the power he built was forged through fear, hatred, and destruction. And like all empires built on such foundations, it collapsed. The war he ignited became the deadliest conflict humanity has ever known. Entire cities vanished beneath bombs. Generations were lost on battlefields stretching across continents. And the Holocaust revealed depths of cruelty that the world still struggles to fully comprehend. Hitler did not only change history. He changed how humanity understands evil, power, and responsibility. His story remains one of history's darkest warnings. A reminder that dangerous ideas do not begin with armies. They begin with words, with fear, with the willingness to blame others during times of crisis. And when those ideas go unchallenged, they can reshape nations and destroy millions of lives. Today, the ruins of that era stand not as monuments to power, but as reminders to remember. To question authority, to protect human dignity, TO recognize how fragile peace can truly be. History does not exist only to tell stories of the past. It exists to protect the future. Thank you for listening, and whenever you return to history, may its lessons guide the world toward wisdom instead of destruction.